Hi guys, so today we're going to talk about this snare drum, which I've taken from a drum set snare, an intermediate sort of Mapex drum set snare, to a concert style or orchestral style snare drum. It went from sort of being a basic intermediate rock snare drum to now it is supposedly going to sound like an expensive concert hall snare drum that I could play with an orchestra. Did it work? I don't know. I'm going to play a solo, probably an excerpt of Cirone at the end of the video, and you can tell me how you think it sounds. The first thing you can visually see is the hoops. These are Ludwig 1950s or 60s marching hoops, and this is one of the only wood drums I own. It's nominally maple, although I think there might be plies of mahogany or basswood in there. It's from 2003, 2004. It's actually a pretty good sounding snare. But I wanted to accentuate the woodiness, so I went with wood hoops rather than the original triple flanged metal hoops. Of course, to do that, you have to have claws to hold the hoops on. So these claws, you will notice, do not all match. The ones on the bottom are wider than the ones on the top, and I actually have two styles on the top, this intermediate width one and this really narrow one. There's a reason for that. One of the reasons is I'm cheap, and so I didn't buy a matching set of 16 of these things. But the other reason is I stole some of these off of a bass drum. Some of them I think I bought online really cheap off of eBay, and some of them I stole off of a different bass drum because specifically most of these have the tension rod stick up above the rim, but the actual side of the drum I wanted to play on, I didn't want to have to contend with hitting my stick on these. So you'll notice I've got a few on here where it's more flush, and that's the side that I would normally stand on and play from. So these intentionally don't match because I don't have 16 of these. But otherwise, they do hold the hoop on just fine. Obviously I didn't refinish the hoops in any way, but they're in okay condition. So that's change number one, although that doesn't in itself make it particularly orchestral. So the next thing I did beside the hoops is I changed the batter head. So it had basically a Mapex branded white coated ambassador head on here, and that's fine for drum set playing, and actually even for like school band that's a pretty standard head. But I wanted to go all the way orchestral, so I got one of these Evans Strata 700s. This is pretty similar to a Remo Renaissance if you're more familiar with that, and it's specifically designed to emulate like a calfskin head. It's pretty thin, and it's a little bit darker. It's still textured, but not as much as an ambassador that was coated. And so this is a legit concert or orchestral style drum head. The next thing that I did on the other side was I changed the snare wires, and this might be the biggest change. Normal snare wires from a drum set snare are curly. I will show you an example. These are normal drum set wires. Zoom in here. You see how they have a spiral to them. These Grover wires do not have that. They are cable snare wires. There's no coil to them. They just lay flat against the head. This is supposed to give you more snare response and better articulation at a lower volume, which is something that you actually would want in an orchestral snare drum. So let me back that back out a little bit. I did not change the bottom head. I've ordered one. Maybe I'll put it on. But this is essentially like an ambassador snare side head. Again, Mapex branded, but it's a pretty reasonably good head, and so this combination I think works okay. So what does this drum not have that a real orchestral snare drum would have? Well, typically they're more than 8 lug. Of course, any good drum is usually 10 lug. In this case, we're missing a few lugs here. The other thing that they would have is typically a much better strainer. So this strainer is of course, regular drum set strainer. It is a single adjustment, and it pulls a set of, as you can see, snare wires that just lay on the head. A good orchestral drum will have multiple different individually adjustable attachment points for snare wires. Typically they'll use these cables, they'll use cords, or they'll use synthetic gut, because of course we're trying to emulate the old school sound of actual gut instead of coiled wires. So this having just a single point at which to attach snares means that I'm a little bit limited. Also, those drums have really deep snare beds, and the snare wires, instead of just coming up to, let's see if I can get it in here, instead of just coming up to here and stopping and having some kind of, in this case, cords to hold it on, the snare wires themselves will go over the bearing edge and attach directly to the strainer mechanism. This is the way all snare drums were up into like even the 1960s. Here's my Superphonic with its Ludwig strainer from 1965, I think, maybe 60, yeah, 65. So these holes right here, which I have the cord through for my standard drum set snare wires, that's not what that's for. These are for actually tying off individual gut or cables, snares to the strainer. And then you run them across the drum, and then you clamp them into the butt plate on the other side. So almost nobody uses these holes anymore, even if you own a drum like this, because that's not how snare wires are typically made. But these drums are in fact set up to have one snare wire individually threaded through each of these holes. The snare wires themselves run around the corner of the drum and come up into the strainer instead of laying flat in like a little bit of a sheet like the normal drum set snare wires. Of course, this drum does not have that, was not designed for that, is not appropriate to do that to, hence I just have the type of wires that you've seen. So here you can see the math. I spent about $96 on all the upgrades, and the drum cost me about $75, but it's negligible sort of because I didn't buy the drum set for this purpose. I already had it, but you could add it in there if you want. And even if you do, I spent about $600 less than a sort of similar, although much, much nicer Pearl Philharmonic snare drum. So if this sounds even remotely good, which we're about to find out, this will be a big victory, saving me $600. So what does it sound like? So in conclusion, I think the Mapex snare is quieter, it has a more focused sound, it's definitely got a darker tone, and it's more responsive at the quietest end. The Superphonic, which again, obviously is a totally different snare drum, but it's set up in a rock style. It has a brighter sound, it's louder with the same amount of effort put in, and it has way less snare response at its quietest dynamics. So I think that maybe I've affected this drum in a positive way. I don't know, what do you think? Thanks for watching, see you guys next time.